Empathy is an ability. You are born with the equipment to develop that ability, but you are not born with that ability. And that is really good news, because empathy is something that you are supposed to develop across your lifetime and continue to practice that ability. You're listening to the Bear in Mind Podcast, episode 157.
A podcast that breaks it down so you can break the cycle for good. Now, your host, Tara Rama, but you can call her T.
Empathy and emotional responsibility is a lot in 10 minutes. And I'm going to break it down into 3 basic principles that will explain empathy so that if you want to develop more of it in yourself, you can do it. And I highly recommend doing that. And if you want to guide that in somebody else, if you're a parent and you want to guide it. And starting with these 3 principles, I often have to come back to that. And there's a lot of wisdom in that when you talk about learning anything, because again, empathy is an ability, you learn it. Whenever you're learning anything, there's always some basic parts to it, to understanding it. And always going back to those basic parts is going to actually help you become better, because we tend to forget them as we think, oh, I've got this down, I've got this empathy down. And then we forget sometimes that it's an ability that we need to practice in a lot of situations, that we sometimes throw it out of the window. So I'm going to relate it back to emotional responsibility, because this is something else that a lot of people ask about. How do you take emotional responsibility? Then how do you guide somebody? And it'll become clearer as I talk more about from the viewpoint of empathy. So the first thing about empathy is that it is an ability. So there are some people that are born without the hardware for it. So that is in the realm of psychopaths, where they actually have something in their brain that is different from somebody else that, I don't know the exact mechanics and the parts of the brain, but they don't have this proper hard wiring to then go on to develop empathy. They can fake it, they can pretend, but then it isn't something that is genuine in them. So we're going to throw out the psychopaths out for this, because I'm imagining they're not listening to this podcast. So then if you're looking at all of us are hardwired for empathy because we have emotions. And so then what we need to do is then keep kind of updating that software, develop that little by little, that ability. And it isn't there in younger children. So to expect them to show it right away isn't there. Now, there are examples of kids doing that, little kids doing that. They're beginning to understand relationships. And so to always remember that empathy is an ability, sometimes we forget that. We forget that it is something we need to practice. And it is something that we need to practice as we age. It isn't something up until emotional maturity around 25 that, okay, it's developed, and then we no longer need to. So even if we don't feel like we're the most empathetic person in our relationships, guess what? We can still build that up because it's an ability. I sometimes even forget that point because sometimes it goes out the window in a lot of situations, but it's the most difficult situations. Those are often the best places to develop and strengthen that ability. The second principle is that empathy is not about relating to somebody's circumstances. And I think that we feel immediate connection to people who maybe look like us, or maybe have the same job, or have the same situation, like the same number of kids, or the same age kids. We automatically associate that relatedness to circumstances. Like we can't relate to somebody, or they can't relate to us because they don't have the same circumstance as me. But empathy is not about circumstances, and circumstances are facts. So I can relate to a mother, and empathy is not that I can't relate to somebody who is not a mother. And that is, or I can relate to somebody better because of their gender. We can be empathetic to somebody that isn't how we classify our gender. So it's not those kind of circumstances, those kind of facts in our lives where empathy is, that's not where empathy comes. We attach to it kind of immediately when we meet somebody who's like us, maybe from the same country, speaks the same language, all of those things, but that is actually not empathy. So empathy then becomes relating to somebody's emotional experience. And I have been challenged on this emotional experience because we think the experience, which is an circumstance, you experience something, you experience loss, something has happened. Somebody went through a fire, their house burned down, that didn't happen to you. You can still relate to their emotional experience. And it happens by identifying with the emotion that they're going through. And that is true with little kids. So oftentimes we don't understand why they're upset that they didn't get a certain color cup. And we can relate to it's a loss. They wanted this and they experienced the loss of having the orange cup instead of the blue cup. Now, we don't have to understand their circumstances. We don't have to understand, because a lot of times we'll say, what's the big deal? It's the same exact cup and it's a different color. But what they're experiencing and noticing that emotional experience is noticing that they lost something. They lost something that they wanted. They wanted the pink cup, and now they're with something that they didn't originally want. Having a friend, let's say, having their house burned down, there's a loss in that you can identify with. And maybe you didn't go through that same thing. Maybe you haven't had a lot of losses at this point in your life. You can tap into things that you have lost that have great meaning to you and understand their emotional experience, because that is actually what empathy is. So you don't have to be like that other person. You don't have to have the same circumstances. You don't have to look like them. You don't have to speak the same language. You can identify what emotion, if they're talking to you, what emotion they must be experiencing. You can often guess by the way they're telling the story. Although language is a part of it, we pick up a lot of nonverbals. We can tell if somebody's agitated, upset, sad, happy, and we can identify with that emotional experience, even if all of the circumstances are nothing we think that we can, quote unquote, relate to. And the third principle is related to emotional responsibility. So empathy, the principle of this is empathy is not taking on responsibility, taking on somebody's emotional responsibility. So in relationships, we often feel that we cause somebody to feel a certain way. So if we yell at a child and they're upset, we feel like we caused their upset. And at a certain level, there is their emotional experiencing that's happening, and then there's your emotional experience that's happening. And emotional responsibility is taking responsibility and ownership of what is happening to you and not the other person. Now, this is very tricky. This is also a very culturally taboo thing in some cultures where people really believe that you are responsible for how somebody else feels. What you're doing is you're looking at how somebody else feels and trying to control that rather than bringing it back to yourself and trying to control your own emotions and your own behaviors and adjusting that. Taking ownership for, okay, let's say you did yell. The ownership in that is I was angry. I'm going to investigate why I felt angry in this moment. What was the belief? What was the thoughts that were driving my anger that I was having? And I'm going to own that. I'm going to own the fact that I yelled. And you can separate out that, and you can understand through the second principle that you don't need to relate to the circumstance. You can understand through that second principle is that somebody else is going through their own emotional experience. So your kid is going through some emotional experience, and you can relate to that and take ownership for your own feelings and actions. And when you do that, when you say, okay, I felt this way, and then I said some things I didn't mean, when you own that, and without looking at somebody else's emotional experience, yes, they may be upset. Let's say it's a friend. You said something to a friend you didn't mean to. But when you take emotional responsibility and say, I said those things, and it came from this really kind of negative place, when you own that, you're more likely to go and then show up and apologize and say, hey, I'm sorry. You don't have to worry and try to correct your friend's behavior. You don't have to worry and try to correct your child's emotional experience. You can own it and then show up and then apologize and then figure out what you want to do next. If you want to course correct that, if you want to make amends, all of those things, but from that place of, I behaved this way because of how I was feeling, and they're feeling that because of how they're behaving that way because of how they're feeling. And you don't need to intermingle them, because when you intermingle them, we often try to control everybody's emotional experience, and then we don't let that person have their own space, their own emotional experience to own. We don't give them that space to own it and let them do something with that and learn how to process that. So I'm going to recap that, because this was probably a lot of things about empathy. So empathy is an ability. Continuously work on it. And I highly recommend, even in the situations where it goes out the window. Empathy is not about relating to somebody else's circumstances, whether they are a parent, whether they have the same job, whether they look like you. Third is, empathy is not taking on somebody else's emotional responsibility. It is about taking your responsibility for how you feel and behave. That's all I have for you this week. I'll check back with you next.
Thanks for listening. Listen for a new episode next Tuesday by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform. Bye for now.